Welcome to Destin. It's always my annual trip to the beach where I actually never experienced the beach. Instead I put on pullovers because the rooms are cold. I leave here and start with student athletes, and then we start in the morning and we'll finish on Thursday afternoon. So this is our second year being a little bit more efficient. Plenty of issues on the table. Talk about football scheduling during the week, talk about the college football playoff, talk about NCAA governance, talk about if there is a settlement, what that might look like, and the work that's been done to prepare for if the settlement is approved. Probably any other number of issues, tiebreakers in women's basketball, tiebreakers in men's basketball as a result. We'll have a conversation about should we move to a permanent site for our softball tournament in the future, and preparing for what's ahead next year. So with that, I'll stop, because tomorrow's introduction will be much longer, I'm certain, and see what you want to talk about.
Greg, can you explain, as you see it, the pros, the upsides to a playoff format with multiple AQs versus a playoff format where all the bids would be decided via at-large selection?
No, not for purposes here. There's a lot attributed to me that is not at this moment attributable to me. So our athletics directors met 3 weeks ago, looked at a set of formats. We have interest in some, we're not committed to any particular format. I have over time talked about, hey, let's just have the fill in the blank number best teams. That goes back to 2019, 2020 playoff expansion. I've reiterated that. I think our room has an interest in a different model. We'll see how that conversation manifests itself this week, and we'll look a little bit more deeply at different ideas, which will put me at some point in a better position to answer those questions.
Would you elaborate on, you said our room has interest in a different model?
Different models, yeah. Our athletics director's room in particular went back to early May when we had a meeting where we focused on some different ideas. So we'll bring back some more information for them to take a look at.
Is it a case where you want to present one or several models to your presidents at the end of this? And
I think it's incorrect to simply focus on the college football playoff at this moment, at least our existence. We've been talking about football scheduling within our own league. I think last year, for example, was a really good experiment. If you go back to last year at this time, I said in the year ahead, we're going to have an expanded playoff. We're going to have an expanded conference. We're going to play an 8-game schedule with those 16 teams. And we're going to learn some things. And so we did. But one of the things you learned is you're not going to divorce your regular season schedule from college football playoff selection. In fact, I think there's more of a feeling that regular season scheduling is governed by college football playoff selection. Witness the discontinuation of a series. When this isn't critical of Troy, it's critical of the reality that, hey, you can drop a big series and it's not going to hurt you come selection time. You have a team that played 4 games against teams with 6-6 records last year that got in. Another team didn't play. Really anybody at the top of its conference was selected in. And it's clear that not losing becomes in many ways more important than beating the University of Georgia, which 2 of our teams were left out did. Nobody had that kind of quality win. So, Andy, I think you can't just like run down a college football playoff selection idea without thinking about, well, if we play 8 or 9 games, what are the impacts? That's the depth of analysis we're looking at. We also look at, and we'll go through this tomorrow, you know, our whether people want to agree with it or not, that's up to them. We can go through the analytics and show the rigor of our schedule is different than anyone else's, period. And we had a learning session in September at the CFP about strength of schedule, and strength of schedule isn't everything, but it is an important factor. And I remember very clearly one of the messages was, if you play the top ranked team and the 130th ranked team, those 2 games average out to 65.5. If you play 65 and 66, they average out to 65.5. And so the advisor said, you're just as well playing 65 and 66. Here's my problem. but for maybe one, maybe two teams in a year, we don't have 65 or 66, and everybody else has a group. It's 60 and below. That has to be considered by us in making our schedule, by the CFP itself in evaluating selection criteria. And while I've one voice asking for that kind of clarity and information, that hasn't exactly changed the criteria as they now exist or provided clarity on how they're applied.
Greg, what are your thoughts on, among the formats that have been discussed among your athletic directors? One of those is 4 automatic qualifiers for the SEC and also for the Big Ten. And the critics out there who over the last month or two have said that that marginalizes your other power conference brethren in the ACC and Big 12, in addition to the other conferences. What are your thoughts on that?
There's critics all over the place. So if you actually go back and do the research, that kind of format could cost us positions, depending on the number of teams. I don't see the critics actually digging in to understand that reality. I don't see the critics actually analyzing, like I've just described, how schedules are evaluated. So the critics can run to the microphones and share their opinions. We're trying to find a format to determine whatever number it is, the best teams in college football. And I think where we are right now is we have used a political process inside a room to come to decisions about football. We should be using football information to come to football decisions. Have to be unanimous. We provide a model and then we sit on our hands for a year and a half, 2 years, as opposed to looking at the depth of issues I'm describing about the game and the concerns about regular season scheduling being impacted by what we have right now. We sat on our hands because we had to have unanimity.
One could say that when you talk about automatic qualifiers, look at the NCAA basketball tournament. If you were to give the ACC a certain amount based off of what was happening a decade ago, they're the strongest conference arguably, and now they are no longer that. They had a record low in percentage representation. So why should we be awarding a conference a certain amount of automatic qualifiers for a certain amount of years? Why should we be setting that in stone for several years?
Is that an editorial or a question?
That's been asked by critics, reporters, everybody out there. Lots at stake right now.
Well, I don't know what you're asking. You're
That's
observing.
the question. Do you believe?
Wait, stop. I just asked you.
Do you believe that's fair?
What's the question?
Do you believe that setting out that format for several years, not just for 1 year, for several years, is fair? Having that static 4 automatic qualifiers for a certain amount of period,
Well,
beyond 1 year is fair.
yeah, your question assumes like one variable when I just walked through their other variables.
They
So
change every year.
Well, I let you ask your question, so you can decide whether you want me to answer the question or not. So there's one variable you asked about, right? Which is if you do this. And I began by saying, we're not committed at this point to something. We're interested.
To your point, Greg, in some years, the model that Brandon's discussing would cost the SEC bids as compared to an at-large only format. Why do you sense that maybe your membership is not more passionately behind the idea of an at-large only format?
Well, in our own room, I've had athletic directors tell me directly that we've given too much away to arrive at these political compromises. That we move teams from outside 12 in. And we've spoken about that before, how many of those compromises does it take? Last week, it took us a while to move beyond a model introduced in 21, early 21, when the conference alignments looked much different than they do now. And so part of, I think, the right conversation is about how do you continue to adapt? Football's not a static game, nor should it be. I think the second recognition is things have changed greatly. And part of where we are in basketball is because we have changed as a membership. So both of our new members were selected at large. We've taken 10 years to move from where we were for the preceding 10 years, so there's not like switch flipping that goes on. I think the word hope is at the center too. Like, how do you bring people into the conversation late in the season in this changing environment? And so the idea of could you have play-in type games continues to populate itself before you're into CFP selection. That's about building interest and giving hope. Whether that's the ultimate destination, we'll see. But to your question, why does it populate itself? Why do people think about it? Even if it costs us something, you could have more teams perhaps involved later in the season through that model.
Greg, in that vein, how much discussion has there been, again, we're going a hypothetical down the road here, so bear with me, two automatic qualifiers going 1-8 and there being a conference title game removed, obviously, and how much the league title game means to this league, how serious is that been discussed?
We haven't talked through that, so that's not at the top of my points of consideration. You have to be mindful of change, and you know, there's a saying, go slow so you can go fast. I think that gets lost these days. You know, people say, sources say, here's an idea, and all of a sudden we're down a road without thinking through all the elements involved in that decision. So we try to help bring those. We probably don't think of everything ourselves right off the bat, so that's why a little bit of time's helpful.
When do you believe that,
Hang on, I'm gonna go to somebody else.
Does the play-in format in any way dilute the regular season any further? You know, if you're pulling in up to 6 teams.
I don't think you can make that an absolute statement. You know, we were having conversations, not necessarily you and I, although we may have. If we go to 12, does that dilute the regular season? I can tell you, as at the Georgia-Texas game on the field the Georgia-Alabama game, so where were we, week 3? Talking with media members who said, it just doesn't feel the same. For those of you that was a pretty incredible night. I think everybody competed at the highest level as hard as they could. And we had that over and over. So I think these absolutes on what does or doesn't impact the regular season are kind of older conversations, maybe not completely informed. I will go back though, when people are canceling games because of the CFP selection process, that directly impacts the regular season.
Yeah.
And that's where, when I talk about, there's a lot more than just one element of these things. I think those are some of the broader list of elements that have to be considered.
If wins and losses is becoming an outsized part of this, does that mean that the selection committee is not doing its job? Is there a lack of faith in the selection committee?
No, I don't think wins and losses are outside, because there's two sides to that coin, right? I think it is, there's been so much effort to get to the point of 12 that the continual evaluation of how are we making decisions got pushed in the background. And the way I look at last year, the learning experience was, it used to be the argument about the top 4. That was it. I'm 5th or I'm 6th and I'm angry. Now you had the last year and the year ahead, you have the top 4 with buys. It's a big deal. You have the next 4 that play home games. That's a big deal. You have the next 4 that are in. And then you have the next 4 who are out. And we had raised the issue when we talked back in 21 as a working group about, you know, how do you adapt some of the criteria. I think the only thing we did is pull out conference championships when you have teams on the margin. So how do you look at strength of schedule? What does that mean? We should be able to contextualize that better. That doesn't mean that it's everything, and so that's a little bit of the wins and losses pieces, because you can have the strongest schedule and go over, and that's not gonna put you in the playoff. So what's the balance, and what's the recognition of rigor that has to be fully considered?
What's the incentive to want to schedule like a Texas at Ohio State when you see that Ole Miss and Alabama, you know, obviously really good teams that didn't get in? Is it going to hurt the fabric to schedule these tough non-conference games out of fear of missing out?
No, I'll go back to the last year of 4 teams when Texas and Alabama played as a non-conference game. I thought, and people had plenty of opinions, that the selection committee honored the importance of that game. I think it's good for college football to have those kind of games. I generally think people believe that way. But you've seen the dominance of CFP access becoming such a big deal. So if you pivot some access points, perhaps you can not be as threatened by a loss, or is it a reward for a win that becomes greater, or an offset, particularly a rigorous win?
But Greg, doesn't it also, some of these models also set up those non-conference games, which you say you would like to, or at least hint that you'd like to preserve and make them inconsequential? Because there would be no consequence if you lost, if who the loser of the Texas-Ohio State game. So I wonder, like, is there a balance that has to be thought of as, like, we'd like to preserve these games, but we also need to preserve the consequences of these games?
I think the first point is, should we like to preserve the games? I think that's one of the problems we're encountering right now. And we've seen that, and I've heard that, and we've even had discussions with our ADs who are thinking about, maybe I shouldn't play this game. Like, don't walk away at this point. So Ralph, I think the first point exists now. I don't think you can say they're inconsequential. Again, I think one of the conversations last year when we went to 12 was we had a big game week 3. Well, it doesn't feel the same. So I would just caution about making the observation that won't have the same meaning or same impact. I think those games do have impact. They do have meaning.
Right.
Now, it may be different from an access point. And that's where I look at some of the weighting of the rhetoric right now that, well, I shouldn't play those games. I'm better off going 11-1, 12-0. I think that's a bigger threat to playing those games than some other model that might be considered.
Is there any anticipation or hope that the House settlement would be approved by now, or there'd be a decision, and how does that guide the discussions this weekend?
Hope, expectation, I've learned a long time ago, we don't control the court system. Is there a hope, is there a thought? Did people say it would be decided at this point? Yes. We have a responsibility for implementation, so does it pivot what we say this week? Yep. Does it mean we're gonna keep preparing? We're gonna keep preparing. We're gonna wait to see the judge's final decision on the proposed settlement.
Greg, back on
The more clarity we can have earlier, because clocks are ticking here, the better.
Greg, about the challenges of teams 11-1, 12-0 being compared against teams with more losses. Were you surprised Alabama did not make the playoff last year?
I don't know that I'd say surprised. I think that's one of the realities, but I spoke in July at media days asking how will a 9-3 team, and I used Georgia's really good example given their 3 really difficult road games. How do you evaluate that against other teams that don't come anywhere close to that? And as I said, we learned something the first time through, and that raises the need for deeper analysis and understanding. If we're going to just incentivize wins, playing fewer winning teams can get you to more wins.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's great for football. I mean, to Ralph's question. So that I think the pressures create the need for something to adapt.
Greg, I remember when you were in Nashville Big Ten meetings, you said, to paraphrase you, that this has to really go well. It has to work the first year of the 12-team playoff. With all the things that you're talking about, if you were to kind of look back, like, did it check that box? With who got left out, who did it, how it worked, selection committee, like, did it work out? Did it really work as well as you were hoping it was going to?
Yeah, I mean, you'd like to have more teams. I think big picture, we went granular right off the bat, which is, hey, there's this model. How do you respond to this model? What's the reason? So if you take a step back, yeah, it went well. We had 12 teams selected. There's always going to be agreement and disagreement. I think we're late in adjusting the seating. I think that could have happened sooner. We've done that for the year ahead. And nobody's asked me about the why of that, so I'll be happy to come back to that. You watch viewership build I think when you actually looked at actual comparisons, so don't compare a January 1 game to a semifinal a week later, but actually look at the performance of that game relative to other sports properties. I think there's a lot of good there. You never sit back and suggest you've reached a destination. There's always work to be done. But I think big picture, I did say that in Nashville, it has to work. I think it did work, and I think it's still has room for improvement. We all got that on our report cards back.
Greg, when discussing the straight seating, with other commissioners, you just kind of brought it up. So what were those conversations like over the last couple of months, looking at what the last college football playoff was with 12 teams, and then making that decision for a straight seating? Can you take us behind the curtain?
Oh yeah, that's a lot of meetings.
Maybe break it down
The
into
Campbell soup version.
Exactly, the overall, yeah, that'd be great.
Which is condensed, the Reader's Digest version, I guess.
That was good.
Well, the notion of reseeding or does the allocation of teams, so part of the criticism is, well, this allocation of teams thing is kind of new. It's not, actually. It exists in different formats. You could be outside the top 12 and moved in. We saw that with a team last year. You'd be outside the top 4 and moved into the top 4. And when the model was developed, you had a Pac-12 as it was historically constituted. You hadn't had the movement. And so when we went through that research at that time, I think every year but one, those top conference champions were either in the top 4 or proximal to the top 4. Then what happened this year is we're down the scale pretty far. We're pulling people out of the top 8 into the top 4. And that wasn't the expectation. So we identified that, that's one. We asked as a group, what might the brackets look like? And you had one sample size, 1 year of real life. There are financial implications because there was a financial award for having received a bye. You had a payment for the first round, second round. Could the math be adjusted there so that people didn't lose in 25? There were efforts to say, well, we won't vote for the 25 season if we don't have guarantees for 26. You know, my position was if it's about kind of straight seating based on the ranking, so we'll keep allocations involved, that I'd commit to 26 and beyond if people are ready to do so. And then there was a point at which, because you needed unanimity to make the change this year, look, we're gonna have to vote at some point, and when we did vote, it was a unanimous vote to make the change. And I think you look at the acceptance of the straight seating model is one. What I said, I'll be very clear, that in the current alignments and in the current playoff, it becomes very difficult to say, well, if you're Texas and you're into 3, why are you to 5? And if you're a Tennessee that earned a home game based on the rankings, why were you displaced to a road game? And that becomes much harder to defend than it looked like it would be in 21. Is that enough behind the curtain?
No, that was enough behind the curtain, yeah. Is
Greg,
there a lot
Greg,
of,
Kirk.
Give the variables, if they change on the 8 or 9 game schedule, any variables gonna grow in prominence on what y'all decide this week on that?
I think the CFP selection process has become a much bigger deal after 1 year. Yeah, I think that one, again, if you go back, since John was kind enough to quote me last year, you can double check. I said, you know, CFP selection, we're gonna go through this 16 team, 8 game, first time. We have schools that think about bowl games primarily in that, but the questions about the selection process, not criticism of the committee, but criteria and process are meaningful. You've seen some say we should go back to the old way of BCS. You know, is there some kind of in between human and machines that can inform? You know, we've got analytics. I'm just going to stay in retirees' quarter because at some point, I've read press announcements on you guys and you keep showing up, asking questions.
Tennessee's Zakai Ziegler is sued for a 5th year of eligibility. Would you like to see college athletes get 5 years of eligibility?
You know, you've kind of cross-pollinated two things. So Zakai and the courts have to decide what's going to happen. I think the introduction of 5 and 5 happened back in like '92. I think I just arrived at the Southland Conference as an assistant commissioner for compliance. Around 15th Avenue in Plano, Texas, with our office, 15th Street, and it was not advanced. It came back in '98 as a commissioner of the Southland Conference. I think at that point we were at the Campbell Towers down off 75, and I was involved in that conversation. It didn't advance. I was here during the era, and the reason I remember is because of a conversation, I think 2006-07, Mike Shula was the coach at Alabama. Mike had asked like a direct question about it, and it didn't advance. So I kind of put that one aside myself. It's been introduced at the national level. I think the conversation has to be informed with the why it didn't advance before. This is primarily an undergraduate experience. We got a lot more summer school. But we have a lot of waivers out there. I think some of the rationale for advancing the idea ties back to, can you get through the waivers and just have something standard? And you could do that at 4 years of eligibility. Plenty of court cases now related to 5 seasons or 5 years, 4 years within 5. I mean, they're all over the place. Should my year count at junior college? Should it count at Division II? Should it count at Division III? I mean, I played 2 years of NAIA baseball and 1 year of junior college basketball, so perhaps there's something out there for me.
I think the NIL money's a driving force in some of this too.
I'll let others speak to their why.
Greg, can I ask you one more playoff question?
Does anybody else who hasn't asked a question have a question? Because I sent Brandon down. I shut Brandon down.
I have a question, whatever.
Well, you didn't raise your hand or anything, so how am I supposed to
I
know?
know we're supposed to raise hands.
Well, or jump in,
Okay.
or retire and then come back and ask more questions.
What is the course of action for the league in maybe the power conferences if the settlement is denied?
I think there are likely several, and I'll let my lawyers speak to that within my rooms, Ross, rather than publish it. I think we're still awaiting, focused on preparing for a settlement as it's been presented at this point.
But do you have a plan?
I go back and indicate you asked about course of action. I think there are several. I think those are properly discussed in our meeting rooms.
How well prepared do you believe you as a conference and your schools, your membership are prepared if the settlement were to be approved on July 1st to kind of hit their ground running with the new landscape?
I think we've prepared as well as we are able. Now, anytime something is new, and I've said this, there's going to be turbulence, there's going to be questions to be answered, and our time frame is compressed between decision and a lot of implementation work. A lot of people spend a lot of time preparing. There'll be questions under like the anti-circumvention clause that's embedded within the settlement. They have to go back to plaintiff's counsel for participatory problem solving. So to the extent we can be prepared, I think I know we've spent an incredible amount of time, energy across the 4 conferences. And, you know, I think the judge said in the order on roster size, I don't get ahead of this decision. And that's part of there's a healthy reminder of why we're waiting as patiently as we can.
You've been, see how I try to jump in there. You've been in NCAA governance committees for 30 plus years, I guess. Right now seems to be an important time as they're
28.
As they're socializing this proposal that grants the power league 65%. Can you just tell us what your views of this proposal? I know you were on the working group, but is 65% enough for the power leagues to have it?
I'll tell you exactly. Do you want me to go back? Like, do you want the
28 years ago?
like,
No, please.
when I walked in, Britt Banowski resigned as commissioner of the Southland Conference in March. In April, I found myself in a transition management council meeting where I had no idea what side was up and down. I will say, I remember an NCAA convention meeting with the Student Athlete Advisory Committee in San Diego, where we had a presentation, student athletes left the room, like, and I'm the Southland Commissioner, we have a trust gap, how are we gonna pivot? And, you know, we don't pivot well. There's a lot of people, a lot of interests to be served. Even in a CFP room, when we finished in January of 22, when was Alabama, Georgia, and Indianapolis? Was that January 22?
That's the 21 season.
21 season, 22. Yeah, when we were at an impasse for like the 6th time in that room, and there were 11 of us, I said, look, because the NCAA building was across the street, everybody wants to point their finger over there. I think we've proven that we are the problem here, not them. And you know, I was done participating in NCAA committees pre-COVID. I think you know, I was on the infractions committee, shared some perspective as I left, whether those were heard or not, and then kind of get, you know, every time I think I'm out, I get pulled back in. I don't know if that's a reflection on me or somebody else. I fell back to trying to write an autonomy list and have that back in 2012, 2013 when I was an associate commissioner. There were more changes that could have been pursued then. It goes to the NCAA board and then it's kind of negotiated back from the ask. I think having if more autonomy had been granted then, that would have been healthy for the entire system, because you can go back and you see where autonomy was used, and I think it's helped everybody. Cost of attendance, more medical care. The concussion protocol came out of the autonomy process, just to name a few. That doesn't mean we're perfect, but I think, you know, having more autonomy would have been helpful. So in this current iteration, Southeastern Conference has asked for more authority and autonomy for the 4 conferences. And we've asked, so I think there's some reporting today about authority to just depart. That's not, I don't have the authority to just depart. That's not been voted upon. I've shared with the decision-making working group, I have people in my room asking, why are we still in the NCAA? Now, the other side of that is we had 13 teams invited to the NCAA baseball tournament today. I've not been notified that anyone has declined the invitation. We had 14 men's basketball teams. Nobody declined those invitations. I think we have like 7 of 16 men's golf teams who are playing today on the final day of stroke play. Nobody's declined those opportunities. So there's inherent value, but how does the association continue to adapt? How do those whose frustration level is at its highest, how maybe are some of those frustrations mitigated? How are some of those frustrations dealt with? The process of change is really exciting at the start. It's like running a marathon, which I've done a few times. Every time I've ever run a marathon, you can't sleep the night before. You're up early. You're at the start line. The start of anything is really exciting. And you go through that, and then you get to the end, and you see, you know, running down Boylston in the Boston Marathon, or in Central Park in New York City, or crossing the river in Missoula, Montana to finish there. I mean, it's exciting, right? There's a finish line. The start and the finish is always invigorating, exciting, but the middle is messy. Whether it's a marathon, whether it's decision-making, whether it's change, and we are in the middle, and it's messy. That's not unique to college sports. That's not unique to higher education. That's not unique to American society. And so, Ross, to go back to the fundamental question, I think we would like to see more authority and autonomy granted under the NCAA heading. We'd like to come together for championships. We think that's critical, important, broad part of college sports. I think there can be more independence in decision-making. We talked about an autonomy division that would be it would be under the NCAA heading clearly. It would be linked, but you'd have more authority and autonomy. But I think you reported on that in January, as I recall. None of my memos ever remained secret. We're at 65%. I think the 68% number is one that's been on our mind, because you can't just have somebody walk away at that level among the four and everything stops. Others have said that's too much. We'll talk through those things this week in depth and see where our leadership concludes as far as our feedback to the decision-making working group. But I've been clear within the room that we are interested in this autonomy grouping having more authority and autonomy within the NCAA structure. I'd like to avoid situations where you're not allowed to put spread on bagels in the future. So for all the finger pointing about who caused these problems, I think it's naive when it's boiled down to some of the statements that have been made in recent weeks.
Commissioner, the sticking point of roster limitations, tell me a little bit about conversations you've had about implementing those. It does feel like a sticking point to the judge's decision, at least, of implementing roster limitations.
More than a sticking point. Go back and relook at it, and then don't come back to me without doing something different. So there's been an assignment from the judge to do something different, particularly for implementation. And so that's been presented, I think, in a way that we think can result in settlement approval, but that's up to the judge.
Commissioner has dinner tonight with student athletes here in a few minutes, so yes, we got one more question.
Can I do?
You go for it, you wait.
Okay. And so to get back to the playoff, but it also, I think, gets to governance to a certain degree. Talking about your ADs have said we've given up too much. You're sort of, again, in a position of thinking about the greater good of college football. That was talked about a lot from other commissioners last week when there was some decision on the seating. How do you balance what is best for the SEC with what is best for maybe giving up a little bit for the SEC would be better for the whole?
Look at a track record. We didn't need 12. Had we stayed at 4, we would have had half the 4 last year. I don't need lectures from others about good of the game. I don't lecture others about good of the game. And coordinating press releases about good of the game. You know, again, okay, you can issue your press statement, but I'm actually looking for ideas to move us forward. So Ralph, I'll go back and say, I thought the 12-team design was really well considered at the time. But we never had a unanimous vote to support the 12-team playoff. So even though I was involved in that work, that didn't mean everybody in this league, when we were at 14, thought it was the best idea. But you engage in that type of problem solving. You know, our 8 or 9 game schedule, that goes back to really 2018. We've been talking about eliminating divisions from 2018 forward, and we expanded. So it became a different conversation, and the shape of that conversation has changed over time. We have to make a decision. The CFP and my colleagues have to understand there's something different here. We all play college football. And so while you ask that of me, I'll go back and say, we didn't need a 12-team college football playoff. Thought it was good for the game. I was involved in that. Others held it up. I thought it was important to get after that work in a time-efficient manner, yet we held up, and then we went fast. We didn't go slow so we could go fast. We didn't do anything, and then we went fast without solving some of the other elements. I think I have a responsibility to push as well. I think my membership has a responsibility and the desire to push me. And that is a hard issue. If you want to go inside what it's like to sit in this role, I think about the responsibility I have here, and I think about the responsibility more broadly all the time. Yesterday I said we don't apologize here. I'm proud we have 13 teams. I wish it was 14. in baseball. I'm proud of what we did in men's basketball. I'm proud that we have, I think it's 5 of 8. Is it 5 of 8 in softball? I actually think that can make other people better too. And when I go back to the college football playoff, I'm open to ideas. There's just not a lot of incoming. My phone's not ringing off the hook. But hey, here's another way to look at it. And so we'll continue to be thoughtful. We'll continue to try to provide perspective and information to our members and help them guide the decision. And ultimately, I recognize I'm the one who ends up typically in front of the podium explaining not just myself, but ourselves. So, good luck to me.
Herb, you said something just real quick. You said there's nothing incoming, other models, but when you guys met last, there were a couple models that were presented, right, to you?
Yeah. Took a while. I mean, there's opportunities for more.
Your reaction to those models?
I would just go back, since you probably know the models, go back and look at those models and look at displacement. So for all the gripes about us having 4 teams, go back and look at the previous 11 years. Nobody loses spots. We actually lose more spots under that model potentially than anybody else. So I get all the criticism, but actually dig into the rankings on Selection Sunday. And I think one year we would have had a 17th place team. It was our 4th team. And if we had this play-in, there'd be another high-level game that likely would have elevated that team into the top 16. But some of those other ideas, pull teams that aren't ranked, that are deep in the 20s, into displacement of teams that are like 10, 11, and 12. And I think we have to continue to dig into those ideas, but that's tough. I don't think it'd be me at the podium in the future if some of those ideas were the ones adopted.
Hey, Greg,
Ralph got it. It was subtle, but Ralph got it.
Greg, would it make sense to just go straight to 16 teams rather than maybe stair-step to 14, but if it's ultimately gonna end
Yeah,
up
remember the
16?
days when we were talking about playing too many games? To John's question about success, I don't think anybody wrote that article last year. Remember that? Well, they could play 17, they could play 16. Did anybody write the article last year about it was too many games? And I didn't hear anybody say it was too many games. I heard coaches talk about how they adapted.
Those spring games.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think like the no spring games, there's a lot about, well, I don't want people to know. I think people know. I actually think that's about preparation, that the rosters change so differently that every one of those days is precious. I actually think that's the bigger reason for some of the changes that have taken place. 16 has had more traction in my league than I would have anticipated a year ago. And over the last, where are we now? We're almost to June. So over the last 6 months, 16 has become much more central in conversation. As I said, we're interested, not committed, but that interest level at 16 is going higher. I think 14, 12 was just 12 until January of 20. That sounds like Nate Borghese in the boat on Saturday Night Live. 12 is 12. It's actually a dozen, as you know. So 12 is 12. There weren't a lot of other ideas floating, and then as we kind of came down to decision time on making a commitment in or out in early 24, 14 was introduced, and I think the natural progression is 16. We did look at all of those numbers. When we looked through the working group, we looked through 4, 5, 7, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. If you're familiar with another great Saturday Night Live skit, The Change Bank, go to that one.
Citywide.
That is the CFP numbers discussion right there.
How do we make money?
Yeah, volume, right? Mike Leach, God rest his soul, 64. Yeah, I threw 64 in there, so I don't know if that was embedded in your question, but we should remember Mike fondly.
Thank you.
Herb said one more, and we have
You'll be here all week.
Try to be here.
Thank you, Chris.
Try to